The pen trembled in his hand. Not from fear. Alexander Drake had conquered fear decades ago when he built his first skyscraper with borrowed money and pure audacity. No, this tremor was different. It was the physical manifestation of defeat, the body's rebellion against a mind that had already surrendered. The Mont Blanc Meisterstück, worth more than most people earned in 6 months, hovered exactly 1 inch above the signature line. One stroke of ink and the Drake Industries empire, $14 billion, 30,000 employees, a legacy spanning 4 decades, would cease to exist. Mr. Drake, his lead attorney spoke, her voice professional but edged with impatience. Catherine Winters of Morrison & Blake was the best corporate attorney in Manhattan, which was precisely why this moment felt so utterly, devastatingly final. We need your signature. The bankruptcy court convenes in 90 minutes. If we miss this window, the involuntary liquidation becomes automatic. Everything will be auctioned. There will be nothing left to negotiate. Alexander didn't respond. His eyes, once famous for their steel-gray intensity that could make board members confess their incompetence with a single glance, were now hollow, empty, the eyes of a man watching his life's work crumble into ash. Across the conference table sat the executioners. His chief operating officer, Thomas Sinclair, a man Alexander had personally mentored for 12 years, sat with his hands folded, his expression carefully neutral. Too neutral. Next to him, representatives from the creditors' consortium, sharks in designer suits who had been circling for months, waiting for this exact moment. The clock on the wall of the Red Star Cafe read 5:47 a.m. Alexander had fled here from his penthouse apartment 3 hours ago, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to breathe in the suffocating luxury that was about to be stripped away. The cafe was one of those all-night establishments that survived on the broken and desperate of New York City, taxi drivers, insomniacs, and apparently fallen titans of industry. He'd chosen the corner booth deliberately, far from the windows, far from witnessing eyes. The heavy leather portfolio containing his corporate death sentence lay open before him, 473 pages of legal documentation that essentially said, "You failed." But it was page 206 that haunted him. A single debt listing that had appeared 8 weeks ago, seemingly from nowhere, like a financial ghost materializing from the shadows of his company's past. A debt so massive, so perfectly timed, that it had triggered a cascade of covenant violations, credit downgrades, and ultimately this, the complete and total destruction of everything he had built. Meridian Holdings, LLC, $420 million. An unsecured promissory note allegedly originated from an acquisition his company had made 17 years ago, somehow overlooked. Until now, when Drake Industries was already weakened by market volatility and aggressive short sellers. Thomas Sinclair had discovered it. Thomas, his protege, his trusted second-in-command, had brought him the documentation 2 months ago, his face appropriately grave, delivering the news like a doctor informing a patient of terminal cancer. "I'm so sorry, Alexander," Thomas had said, and at the time, Alexander had believed the sorrow was genuine. "I've verified it with 3 different legal teams. It's ironclad. We have to list it as a creditor claim. If we don't, and the bankruptcy examiner discovers it later, you could face criminal charges for fraudulent filing." So Alexander had done the responsible thing. He'd reported the debt. He'd triggered his own destruction, because that's what honest men do, even when honesty becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. His phone, lying face up next to the coffee cup, buzzed for the 37th time. Thomas Sinclair, again. The man was relentless. Alexander answered, his voice a dry rasp. "What?" "Where are you?" Thomas's voice carried concern so perfectly calibrated that in his exhausted state, Alexander almost believed it. "The attorneys are here. The creditors are waiting. We need to finalize this and get to court. Alexander, I know this is devastating, but we have to protect what we can. The settlement I've negotiated with Phoenix Group, They're offering to preserve at least 40% of the operational divisions. Some of your people will keep their jobs. That's something. Phoenix Group, the vulture capital firm that had appeared like magic, perfectly positioned to pick apart Drake Industries' most valuable assets at bankruptcy auction prices. And Thomas had brokered the deal, had presented it as mercy when it was actually murder. "I'll be there," Alexander said, his voice barely audible. "Alexander, please, come now, don't make this harder." He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the scarred Formica table. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't touched the food he'd ordered, eggs and toast that now sat congealed and accusing. The waitress approached, coffee pot in hand. She'd been watching him, he realized, with the particular awareness of someone trained to observe human suffering. Service industry workers were anthropologists of despair. "Warm up?" she asked, her voice carrying the flattened vowels of exhaustion. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that held the specific weariness of someone working the graveyard shift because they had no other choice. Alexander nodded without looking at her. She poured, the stream of bitter liquid filling his cup with mechanical precision. But she didn't leave. She stood there, pot still in hand, her gaze fixed on something. "Sir," she said quietly, so quietly that at first Alexander thought he'd imagined it. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but that document, that company name." Alexander's head snapped up, his exhausted brain suddenly, violently alert. "Excuse me." The waitress, her name tag read Claire Walsh, was staring at the open portfolio, specifically at page 206, which lay exposed in the harsh fluorescent light of the cafe. "Meridian Holdings," she said, her voice strange now, tight with something that sounded almost like recognition, almost like shock. That's not possible." Alexander stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Claire's hand was shaking now, the coffee pot trembling in her grip. She set it down on the table with a soft clink. "Sir, I need to ask you something, and I know this is going to sound insane, but where did that debt come from? Who discovered it?" "My COO," Alexander heard himself say, his voice distant, confused. "Why, how do you?" "Because," Claire interrupted, and her voice was no longer that of a tired waitress but something else entirely, sharp, focused, furiously intelligent. "Because 4 years ago, I was a senior forensic analyst at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I spent 8 months investigating a shell company used in a massive securities fraud scheme. A company that existed only on paper, designed specifically to fabricate debts and manipulate bankruptcy proceedings." She pointed at the document with a finger that was completely steady now, despite the tremor in her hand moments before. "That company," she said, her voice cutting through the early morning silence of the cafe like a blade, was called Meridian Holdings. The world stopped. Alexander Drake, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals while remaining completely calm, who had stared down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers without flinching, felt his heart actually skip a beat. "What did you say?" Club pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking permission. Her exhaustion had vanished, burned away by something fierce and focused. 4 years ago, the SEC investigated Kadava Tech Systems. You remember that case? It made headlines. The CEO was convicted of securities fraud, 23 years in federal prison. Alexander nodded slowly. He remembered. It had been one of the biggest white-collar crime cases of the decade. What they didn't make headlines, Cluck continued, her words coming faster now, was the method. The CEO, Gregory Kadava, he didn't just cook his books. He created a phantom debt, a false creditor claim for $380 million payable to a shell company. That debt triggered a manufactured bankruptcy, which allowed his silent partners to buy the company's assets at pennies on the dollar. It was brilliant, brutal, and almost impossible to detect, because the debt looked completely legitimate. The shell company, Alexander whispered, was called Meridian Holdings, Clough finished. I tracked it. I traced every thread. It led to a corporate services firm in the Cayman Islands, a law office in Luxembourg, and ultimately, nowhere. The ultimate beneficiaries were hidden behind so many layers of corporate proxies that even with subpoena power, we couldn't crack it. But I knew it was an inside job. Someone close to Cordova created that phantom debt to destroy him and profit from his destruction. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing now. Sir, that company was dissolved 4 years ago as part of the criminal proceedings. It doesn't exist anymore. It can't exist. Unless someone recreated it, Alexander finished, his mind suddenly, violently clear. The fog of despair that had clouded his thoughts for 2 months evaporated in an instant. Unless someone used the exact same structure, the exact same name, because they knew it had worked before. Who discovered this debt? Clough demanded. Who brought you the documentation? Thomas Sunkla, Alexander said, and as he spoke the name, pieces began falling into place with horrifying precision. My COO. He's been with me for 12 years. He's the one who found the promissory note. He verified it. He insisted we report it immediately or face criminal liability. Clough's face went pale. He set you up. This is the same playbook. Create a massive phantom debt, force a bankruptcy, then have a buyer conveniently positioned to acquire the assets. Who's the lead bidder on your company? Phoenix Group, Alexander said, his voice hollow. A private equity firm. Thomas negotiated the deal directly with them. He said he was trying to save what he could. He said, Alexander stopped, a wave of nausea rolling through him. He said they were offering him a position, chief restructuring officer of the new entity. He framed it as them recognizing his competence during the crisis, as them wanting continuity. It's his reward, Clough said flatly. They're not buying your company. He's selling it to them. And that $420 million debt, it's probably going to mysteriously disappear in the bankruptcy proceedings, claimed as paid or forgiven, and the money will flow to an offshore account he controls. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. You're telling me that everything, the creditor meetings, the lawyer consultations, the last 8 weeks of hell, has been orchestrated fraud? Yes, Clough said simply. And in 90 minutes, unless we stop it, it's going to be legally finalized. The two of them sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the hum of the Kafuz's ancient refrigerator and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Finally, Alexander spoke. Why did you leave the SEC? Clough's jaw tightened. Because after I broke the Cordova case, after I gave them Meridian Holdings on a silver platter, my supervisor took credit for my work, presented my analysis as his own, got a promotion. When I complained, I was reassigned to reviewing parking violations for government contractors, so I quit. I had bills, I had student loans, and I ended up here serving coffee to people who don't see me. I see you now, Alexander said quietly. Then more urgently, can you prove this? Can you prove that Meridian Holdings is fraudulent? Clough hesitated. Not from here. Not without access to corporate databases, SEC filings, international corporate registries. But Mr. Drake, I know this scheme. I know its signature. The debt amount, the timing, the convenient buyer, the trusted insider who discovered it, this isn't a coincidence. This is the exact same pattern. Alexander pulled out his phone. His hands were steady now, charged with a cold fury that had burned away the tremors of defeat. I have 90 minutes, I have resources, and I have the login credentials to my company's entire financial database because Thomas never thought to revoke my access. He assumed I'd be too broken to use them. He looked at Clough, and for the first time in 8 weeks, his eyes held something other than despair. They held purpose. Help me destroy him. Clough didn't hesitate. She stood up, already untying her apron. I'll need a computer, fast internet, and access to your corporate files. There's a 24-hour business center 2 blocks from here, Alexander said, already moving. He threw $500 bills on the table, more than enough to cover a $4 cup of coffee and communicate the urgency of his departure. As they rushed toward the door, the cook called out from the kitchen, "Cla, your shift isn't over for 3 hours." Cla didn't even turn around. "Tell Drummond I quit." The cold December air hit them like a slap as they burst onto the street. The city was that strange pre-dawn gray, caught between night and morning, between endings and beginnings. "Mr. Drake," Cla said as they half ran down the sidewalk, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "If I'm right about this, if we can prove it, Thomas Sunkla isn't just committing fraud. He's committing it while knowing exactly how Cordova ended up. He's seen the playbook for how this type of crime gets prosecuted. Meaning he's either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident he won't get caught," Alexander finished. "Exactly, which means he's covered his tracks. We're going to have to be smarter than smart." They reached the business center, a sterile glass and chrome facility that catered to travelers and remote workers. Alexander strode to the counter, where a bored attendant was scrolling through his phone. "I need your best computer, 2 hours. And complete privacy," Alexander said, sliding his black American Express card across the counter. The attendant, recognizing both the urgency and the unlimited credit line, didn't ask questions. 3 minutes later, they were in a private office with a high-speed computer and a door that locked. Claire sat down at the keyboard, her fingers already flying across the keys before Alexander had even taken the chair next to her. "Give me your login, and pray that Thomas's arrogance is greater than his caution." As Alexander typed in his credentials, he found himself watching this woman, this waitress who'd served him coffee 20 minutes ago and was now accessing corporate financial databases with the fluid expertise of a trained investigator. How does someone go from SEC forensic analyst to graveyard shift waitress? He asked quietly. Claire didn't look away from the screen, her eyes scanning rows of financial data as they populated. Same way someone builds a $14 billion empire and ends up signing bankruptcy papers in a cafe at dawn. Life has a way of humbling all of us, Mr. Drake. "Call me Alexander." "Fine, Alexander. Now shut up and let me work. We have 83 minutes. Her fingers moved faster. "If you're feeling the intensity of this story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me what you think happens next. This story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. Don't miss what comes next." Claire's eyes moved across the screen with surgical precision, scanning transaction logs, wire transfer records, and corporate filings with the speed of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Alexander sat beside her, feeling simultaneously useless and electrified, watching his entire corporate empire reduced to rows of data and decimal points. "There," Claire said suddenly, her finger stabbing at a transaction on the screen. "Look at this wire transfer from 8 weeks ago, the exact date Thomas brought you the Meridian Holdings documentation." Alexander leaned closer. The entry showed a payment of $85,000 to a consulting firm called Blackridge Advisory Services, with a memo line reading, "Due diligence, legacy debt verification." "I don't recognize that firm," Alexander said. "You wouldn't," Claire replied, already opening a new browser tab. "Because I'm willing to bet it doesn't exist in any meaningful way. It's another shell." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up corporate registry databases. There, Blackridge Advisory Services, incorporated in Delaware, which is red flag number 1 because Delaware lets you hide ownership 3 months before your debt mysteriously appeared. Single listed director, a corporate services agent. No employees. No website, no phone number beyond a voicemail service. "What does that mean?" "It means," Claire said, her voice tight with controlled fury, "that Thomas paid $85,000 of your company's money to his own fake consulting firm to create a paper trail showing he verified the debt. He's building himself an alibi. If anyone questions how the debt was validated, he can point to this payment and say, "Look, I hired independent consultants. How was I supposed to know they were fraudulent?" Alexander felt his jaw clench. The consultants he hired were himself. Exactly. Claire was already pulling up another screen. Now let's find where that $85,000 actually went. If this follows the Cordova playbook, the money will bounce through 2 or 3 intermediary accounts before ending up in. She stopped, her eyes widening. "Oh, you arrogant idiot." "What?" Claire turned the screen toward him. "The final destination account is in Thomas Sinclair's name, not hidden, not offshore. His actual personal account at Manhattan Savings and Trust. He paid himself $85,000 and just assumed no one would ever look closely enough to trace it." "That's evidence," Alexander said, his heart beginning to pound. "That's proof he fabricated the verification." "It's a start," Claire cautioned. "But it's not enough. A good lawyer, and Thomas will have very good lawyers, can argue that this was a legitimate consulting payment, that Blackridge was recommended to him, that he had no idea it was fake. We need the smoking gun. We need to prove that Meridian Holdings itself is fraudulent." She pulled up a new screen, this one showing an international corporate registry database. "Let me show you something. This is the original Meridian Holdings from the Cordova case. See this? It was incorporated in the Cayman Islands on March 15th, 4 years ago. And here," she clicked to a different screen, "is the Meridian Holdings claiming to be your creditor, also incorporated in the Cayman Islands. Want to guess when?" Alexander stared at the date on the screen. March 15th, the same date. "Not just the same date," Claire said, her voice vibrating with intensity. "The exact same corporate registration number, just with 2 digits transposed. Look, the original was registration number GC47821. Your creditor is GC47281. That's not a coincidence. That's someone copying their own homework and hopping no one checks." "Why would Thomas do something so sloppy?" "Because he did it 4 years ago and it worked," Claire said. "Because the original Meridian Holdings was never fully investigated. We caught Cordova, we froze the company, but we never identified the person who actually created it. That person walked away clean. And that person," she turned to look at Alexander directly, "I'm almost certain was Thomas Sinclair." The office suddenly felt very cold. 4 years ago," Alexander said slowly, working through the implications, "Thomas was. He was at Henderson and Associates. He was a consultant, corporate restructuring specialist." "Who was his biggest client?" Alexander's mind raced back, pulling up old conversations, old details. "He did a lot of work for tech companies. He was consulting for Cordova Tech Systems. He was their interim CFO during their market evaluation for potential sale." Claire's smile was sharp and cold. "There it is. Thomas Sinclair created Meridian Holdings to destroy Gregory Cordova and profit from his company's bankruptcy. It worked perfectly. He walked away with however many millions while Cordova went to prison. And now, 4 years later, he's using the exact same playbook on you." "But why me?" Alexander demanded, frustration and betrayal warring in his voice. "I gave him everything. I promoted him. I paid him millions. Why destroy me?" "Because 14 billion is more than millions," Claire said simply. "Because with you gone, he gets to be the savior who rescued what he could. He gets to run your company under new ownership. And he gets $420 million in phantom debt payments that will somehow get restructured right into his offshore accounts." She paused. "Alexander, men like Thomas don't see loyalty. They see opportunity. You were just the biggest opportunity in his reach." Alexander stood up, packing the small office like a caged animal. "We have proof. We have the wire transfer. We have the corporate registration duplication. We have his connection to the Cordova case. That's enough to at least delay the bankruptcy filing, isn't it? To force an investigation." "Maybe," Claire said, but her tone was uncertain. "But Alexander, we have 68 minutes. Your bankruptcy hearing is at 8 a.m. Even if we go to the police right now, even if we go to the FBI, there's no way they can investigate, verify, and get a court order to stop the proceedings in time. The system doesn't move that fast. Then what do we do? Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring at the screen, her mind clearly working through possibilities and rejecting them one by one. Then her expression changed. We don't go through the system. We go around it. What does that mean? She turned to him, her eyes sharp. Thomas's plan only works if you sign those bankruptcy papers. If you don't sign, if you refuse, the whole thing collapses. The creditors can't force an involuntary Chapter 7 liquidation without proving you're actually insolvent. And if you can show reasonable doubt about your largest debt, if you can demonstrate that the Meridian Holdings claim is under investigation for fraud, the bankruptcy court has to delay the proceedings. I'm not signing, Alexander said immediately. Obviously, but Thomas will just claim I'm having a breakdown, that I'm not thinking clearly. The lawyers will say I'm being irrational. Let them, Claire said, a dangerous smile crossing her face. Because while they're saying that, we're going to be presenting our evidence, not to the police, not to the FBI, to someone who has the power to stop everything instantly. Who? The bankruptcy judge herself, Claire said. Judge Rachel Morrison. She's hearing your case. She's a former federal prosecutor who specialized in corporate fraud, and she has a reputation for absolutely destroying lawyers who try to perpetrate fraud in her courtroom. Alexander felt hope kindle for the first time in months. You want us to walk into court and expose Thomas in front of the judge? Not just expose him, Claire said, her smile growing sharper. Destroy him, publicly, irrevocably. We're going to hand Judge Morrison enough evidence that she'll have federal marshals in that courtroom before Thomas can even run. That's insane. That's justice. Claire began rapidly saving files to a thumb drive, her movements precise and practiced. But we need one more thing. We need to connect Thomas directly to Phoenix Group. We need to prove they're not independent buyers but active participants in the fraud. Otherwise, Thomas can claim they were fooled too, and they walk away. Alexander moved back to the computer, pulling up his email. Thomas has been corresponding with Phoenix Group for weeks. Let me search his name, and he stopped, staring at the screen. What? There's an email chain here, between Thomas and someone at Phoenix Group named Carter Hayes, but it's not in my company email. It's in Thomas's personal account. How did this? He trailed off, then cursed. He's been using our corporate Wi-Fi for his personal email. The IT backup systems captured everything. Claire leaned over, reading the emails, her expression growing darker with each line. Oh, Thomas, you beautiful idiot. Listen to this one from 6 weeks ago. Carter, the debt is filed. Drake is panicking exactly as predicted. He'll sign anything we put in front of him. Have your team ready to move the moment the bankruptcy is official. Once we own his assets, the Meridian claim gets restructured as planned, and you wire my participation bonus to the account we discussed. Participation bonus, Alexander repeated, his voice hollow. He's calling the fraud proceeds of participation bonus. And here's Carter Hayes' response, Claire continued. Thomas, your performance has been exceptional. The board has approved your CEO appointment pending acquisition. Your compensation package will be $45 million over 3 years, plus the carry on Meridian. By this time next month, you'll be running Drake Industries, and Alexander Drake will be a footnote. The silence in the office was absolute. Save everything, Alexander said, his voice lethal. Every email, every transaction, every piece of evidence. We're going to bury him so deep he'll never see daylight again. Claire was already copying files, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. We have 43 minutes. We need to print these documents, organize them into a presentation that Judge Morrison can follow instantly, and get to the courthouse. Can you get us into that courtroom? I'm the defendant, Alexander said grimly. "They can't start without me." "Perfect." Claire ejected the thumb drive and grabbed her coat. "Then let's go ruin Thomas Sinclair's day." They burst out of the business center into the freezing December morning. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale gold. The city was waking up, unaware that in a courthouse downtown, a war was about to begin. Alexander flagged a cab with the commanding presence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. As they climbed in, Claire turned to him. "Alexander, when we walk into that courtroom, Thomas is going to panic. He's going to try to discredit me, discredit you, claim this is a desperate fabrication. It's going to get ugly." "Let it," Alexander said, his voice hard as steel. "I've been building companies while men like Thomas were learning how to steal. He wants ugly. I'll show him what a $14 billion war looks like." The cab wove through morning traffic, every red light feeling like an eternity. Claire used the time to organize the documents on her phone, creating a digital presentation that could be projected in the courtroom. Her fingers moved with absolute certainty, and Alexander found himself wondering how someone with her skills had ended up serving coffee at 5 a.m. "Claire," he said quietly, "after this is over, assuming we're not both in jail for contempt of court." "We won't be," she interrupted. "Judge Morrison doesn't tolerate fraud. She'll see what we're showing her." "Assuming that's true," Alexander continued, "you need to stop working at that cafe." "I need to pay rent," Claire said pragmatically, not looking up from her phone. "You need to come work for me," Alexander said. "Head of Corporate Security and Fraud Prevention. Name your salary." Claire finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "Ask me again when we've won." The cab pulled up to the courthouse, a massive granite building that looked like justice carved in stone. They had 17 minutes. They ran up the courthouse steps, through security, and down marble corridors that echoed with their footsteps. Alexander knew the way. He'd been here for depositions during the lead-up to this nightmare. Courtroom 7B was at the end of a long hallway. Through the small window in the door, Alexander could see them. Thomas Sinclair, looking perfectly composed in an immaculate suit, talking quietly with the Phoenix Group representatives. The attorneys from Morrison and Blake were reviewing documents. The creditors' committee members were checking their phones. They were all waiting for him to arrive, sign his company away, and let them carve up his empire. "Ready?" Claire asked. Alexander straightened his tie, rolled his shoulders back, and felt the old familiar sensation of walking into a hostile negotiation. Except this time, he wasn't negotiating. He was going to war. "Let's end this," he said, and pushed open the courtroom doors. The courtroom fell silent the moment Alexander Drake walked through the doors. Every head turned, and Thomas Sinclair's carefully composed expression flickered, just for a microsecond, with something that might have been concern. But Thomas was good. Alexander had to give him that. Within half a breath, the concern vanished, replaced by what appeared to be genuine relief. "Alexander," Thomas stood, moving toward him with his hand extended, his voice pitched perfectly for the watching attorneys and creditors. "Thank God, we were getting worried. Are you all right? You look." "I look like a man who's been awake all night discovering he's been systematically betrayed by someone he trusted," Alexander said, his voice cutting across the courtroom with the authority of a man who had commanded boardrooms for 30 years. He didn't shake Thomas's hand. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Catherine Winters, his lead attorney, stepped forward, her expression concerned but professional. "Mr. Drake, we really need to proceed. Judge Morrison will be entering any moment and we're all ready." "I'm not signing," Alexander said flatly. The courtroom erupted. Attorneys began talking over each other. The creditors' committee representatives rose from their seats in protest. And Thomas's mask finally cracked completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Alexander, you can't be serious," Thomas said, and now his voice carried an edge. "We've been over this. You're out of options. If you don't sign, the court will force a Chapter 7 liquidation. You'll lose everything anyway, but without any control over the process. This settlement is the only way to preserve." "Preserve?" Alexander's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Is that what you're calling it? The way a predator preserves meat?" Catherine Winters moved between them, her professional composure beginning to fray. "Mr. Drake, I don't know what's happened overnight, but you need to understand the legal reality. We have a filed bankruptcy petition. We have documented debts exceeding your assets by $420 million. We have creditors who are prepared to force liquidation if you don't cooperate with this restructuring. You cannot simply walk in here and—" "The $420 million debt is fraudulent," Alexander said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. Absolute silence. Then chaos. Thomas recovered first. "That's insane. Alexander, you're clearly not well. The stress has." "The Meridian Holdings debt is fabricated," Alexander continued, speaking over him. "Created specifically to force Drake Industries into bankruptcy, allowing a predetermined buyer to acquire our assets at a fraction of their value, with the phantom debt later being restructured into offshore accounts controlled by the person who created it." Carter Hayes, the Phoenix Group representative, stood up, his face reddening. "This is outrageous. We are a legitimate investment firm. We're prepared to pursue legal action for these defamatory—" "Please do," Claire said, speaking for the first time. She'd been standing quietly behind Alexander, and now she stepped forward into the light. "I'd love to explain to a jury how Phoenix Group's communications with Mr. Sinclair reference participation bonuses and carry on Meridian." Thomas's face went white. "Who is this woman?" "My name is Claire Walsh," she said calmly, "former senior forensic analyst with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I specialized in bankruptcy, fraud, and shell company investigations, and I've spent the last 3 hours documenting your crime in exhaustive detail." "This is a circus," Thomas snapped, turning to the attorneys. "Catherine, this woman is nobody. She's disrupting legal proceedings with conspiracy theories. We need to have her removed and—" The door to the judge's chambers opened. "All rise," the bailiff called, the Honorable Judge Rachel Morrison presiding. Judge Morrison entered, and Alexander understood immediately why Claire had been so confident. Morrison was a small woman in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a federal prosecutor for 20 years before taking the bench, and her reputation for destroying lawyers who wasted her time was legendary. She looked at the packed courtroom, the standing attorneys, the visible tension, and one eyebrow rose. "This is a routine bankruptcy filing for Drake Industries. Why does my courtroom look like a murder trial?" "Your Honor," Catherine Winters began, "we apologize for the disruption. Mr. Drake is experiencing some last-minute concerns about the proceedings, and we just need a moment to—" "I'm not having last-minute concerns," Alexander interrupted. "I'm alleging fraud." Judge Morrison's other eyebrow joined the first. She sat down slowly, folding her hands on the bench. "Mr. Drake, you are represented by one of the finest corporate law firms in New York. Are you seriously standing in my courtroom and accusing your own attorneys of fraud?" "Not my attorneys," Alexander said. "My chief operating officer, Thomas Sinclair, and his partners at Phoenix Group. They fabricated a $420 million debt to force my company into bankruptcy." The silence that followed was profound. Judge Morrison looked at Thomas, then at Carter Hayes, then back at Alexander. "That is an extremely serious allegation. Do you have proof?" "We do, Your Honor," Claire said, stepping forward. "Extensive documentation, transaction records, corporate filings, email correspondence. If you'll give us 10 minutes, we can present everything." Judge Morrison studied Claire for a long moment. "And you are?" A waitress who used to be an SEC investigator, Claire said evenly, who happens to have investigated the exact same fraud scheme 4 years ago when it was used to destroy Cordova Tech Systems. Thomas actually laughed. It was a desperate sound trying to masquerade as confidence. Your Honor, this is absurd. These are the fantasies of a man who can't accept that his company failed, a waitress with delusions of. Mr. Sinclair, Judge Morrison said, her voice cutting like a scalpel, I didn't ask for your commentary. I asked Mr. Drake if he had proof. She turned back to Alexander. Present it. You have 10 minutes, and this better not be a waste of my time. Claire moved forward, pulling out a laptop and connecting it to the courtroom's presentation system. Within seconds, documents began appearing on the large screen mounted on the wall. Your Honor, Claire began, her voice steady and professional. 8 weeks ago, Thomas Sinclair presented Alexander Drake with documentation of a $420 million debt allegedly owed to a company called Meridian Holdings. This debt triggered covenant violations that forced Drake Industries into bankruptcy proceedings. The screen showed the original debt document. However, Claire continued, Meridian Holdings is not a legitimate creditor. It's a shell company incorporated in the Cayman Islands using a corporate registration number that's nearly identical to a shell company I investigated 4 years ago during the Cordova Tech Systems fraud case. She clicked to the next slide, showing the two registration numbers side by side. The original Meridian Holdings, registration GC 47821, was used to fabricate a phantom debt that destroyed Cordova Tech. The current Meridian Holdings, registration GC 47281, is using the exact same structure, incorporated on the exact same date, March 15th, just 4 years later. Thomas was on his feet. This is circumstantial nonsense. Similar names don't prove. I'm not finished, Claire said coldly. She clicked to the next slide. 8 weeks ago, Drake Industries paid $85,000 to a consulting firm called Blackridge Advisory Services, allegedly to verify the Meridian Holdings debt. The payment was authorized by Thomas Sinclair. The wire transfer appeared on screen. Blackridge Advisory Services is another shell company. No employees, no office, no real operations. And the $85,000, it was ultimately deposited into Thomas Sinclair's personal bank account. He paid himself company money to create a fake verification of his own fake debt. The courtroom exploded with noise. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order, let her finish. Claire's voice rose above the chaos. But the smoking gun, Your Honor, is this. She clicked to the email chain. These are emails between Thomas Sinclair and Carter Hayes of Phoenix Group, discussing participation bonuses, Thomas's future CEO position, and the planned restructuring of the Meridian claim once Phoenix Group acquires Drake Industries' assets. The emails filled the screen, and Judge Morrison leaned forward, reading intently. Her expression grew darker with each line. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice shaking now, those emails are taken out of context. They're discussing legitimate. Mr. Hayes, Judge Morrison interrupted, turning her gaze to the Phoenix Group representative. You're being offered an opportunity to speak. Do these emails exist? Did your firm promise Mr. Sinclair a CEO position and compensation tied to this bankruptcy? Carter Hayes looked like a trapped animal. His lawyers were whispering frantically in his ear. Finally, he spoke. Your Honor, Phoenix Group withdraws its bid for Drake Industries' assets, effective immediately. We were operating on information we believed to be accurate. We had no knowledge of any alleged fraud. How convenient, Judge Morrison said dryly. She turned back to Thomas. Mr. Sinclair, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I suggest you consider your answer very carefully. Did you create or participate in creating the Meridian Holdings debt claim? Thomas's face was the color of old paper. Alexander could see him calculating, searching for an escape route, finding none. "Your Honor, I was following proper procedures. I discovered the debt during a routine audit of legacy acquisitions. I verified it through appropriate channels. If there were irregularities in the verification process, I was unaware." "You paid yourself $85,000, Judge Morrison said flatly. "You corresponded with the buyer about participation bonuses. And according to Ms. Walsh, you were also connected to the original Meridian Holdings fraud 4 years ago. Mr. Sinclair, I'm ordering an immediate stay of all bankruptcy proceedings pending a full criminal investigation." She turned to her bailiff. "Contact the U.S. Attorney's Office. I want fraud investigators in this building within the hour." Then she looked at the attorneys from Morrison and Blake. "Ms. Winters, your firm has some serious questions to answer about due diligence failures. I suggest you cooperate fully with the investigation." Catherine Winters looked shell-shocked. "Your Honor, we relied on information provided by Drake Industries' own COO. We had no reason to suspect." "That's what due diligence means, counselor," Judge Morrison snapped. "You verify, you don't just accept." She stood. "This hearing is adjourned. Mr. Drake, your company remains under your control pending investigation. Mr. Sinclair, you are not to leave this jurisdiction. Bailiff, make sure he understands that clearly." As Judge Morrison exited, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Thomas tried to bolt for the door, but the bailiff and courthouse security were already there. Carter Hayes and his Phoenix Group team were surrounded by their own lawyers, everyone talking at once, everyone trying to distance themselves from the implosion. Alexander stood in the center of it all, watching Thomas being detained, watching his empire being handed back to him, and felt something he hadn't felt in months: control. Claire stood beside him, quietly packing up her laptop. "That went better than I expected." "Better?" Alexander said, almost laughing. "You just saved $14 billion and put a criminal in handcuffs in under 10 minutes. 8 minutes, Claire corrected. Judge Morrison is efficient." Alexander turned to face her fully. "The job offer stands, head of corporate security, whatever salary you want, start today." Claire smiled, but it was tired. "Alexander, I appreciate it, but I need to think about it. I spent 4 years trying to get back into this world and it destroyed me. I'm not sure I want to." "You just did in 3 hours what most forensic teams couldn't do in 3 months, Alexander interrupted. "You're brilliant. You're relentless. And you saw something everyone else missed because you were paying attention when no one thought you mattered." He paused. "The world needs people like you in positions of power, not serving coffee at dawn because the system failed you." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Ask me again in a week, after I've slept." "Deal." Epilogue 3 months later. The conference room on the 52nd floor of Drake Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Alexander stood at the head of the table, looking at his newly restructured leadership team. Thomas Sinclair's empty chair had been removed entirely, as if he'd never existed. In his place, at Alexander's right hand, sat Claire Walsh. She wore a crisp suit, her hair pulled back professionally, and she radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her position through merit rather than manipulation. "The SEC investigation concluded yesterday," Alexander announced to the room. "Thomas Sinclair has been formally charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Carter Hayes and Phoenix Group are facing civil penalties, and Drake Industries has been fully cleared of any wrongdoing." Applause rippled through the conference room. "But," Alexander continued, his voice serious, "we learned something important from this experience. We learned that trust without verification is dangerous, that loyalty without accountability is blind, and that the people we overlook, the ones society decides don't matter, might be the ones holding the answers we desperately need." He looked at Claire, who met his gaze with calm professionalism. "Claire Cla Walsh was serving coffee at a diner when she saved this company, not because she was trying to impress anyone, not because she wanted recognition, but because she saw something wrong and refused to look away. Alexander paused, letting his words sink in. How many other brilliant people are out there, overlooked and underestimated, because we decided their current circumstances define their value? The room was silent. From today forward, Drake Industries implements a new hearing initiative, Alexander continued. We're partnering with workforce development programs to identify talented individuals who have been sidelined by circumstances, people with skills and intelligence who just need an opportunity. Because if we judged Cla by her apron instead of her abilities, I'd be bankrupt, and Thomas Sunkla would be running this company into the ground. More applause, this time sustained and genuine. After the meeting, as people filed out, Cla approached Alexander. That was a good speech. It was true, Alexander said simply. You changed everything, Cla. You reminded me that dignity isn't about position, it's about character. That respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. Cla smiled. You know what I've learned? That patience isn't weakness, that observation is power, and that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. Speaking of advantages, Alexander said, pulling out an envelope, your first quarterly bonus, head of corporate security, is working out well. Cla opened it and her eyes widened. Alexander, this is exactly what you're worth, he finished. Maybe more. Consider it back pay for all those years the system told you to serve coffee instead of changing the world. Cla carefully tucked the envelope into her jacket. You know the irony. I learned more about human nature working at that diner than I ever did at the SEC. When people think you're invisible, they show you who they really are. That's how I recognized Thomas's scheme, because I'd spent years watching people reveal themselves when they thought no one important was watching. Then the world is lucky, Alexander said, that someone important was always watching. She just didn't wear a title yet. The moral. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting golden light across Drake Tower, Alexander stood alone in his office, looking at the city below. He thought about Thomas Sunkla, rotting in federal custody awaiting trial. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything because he'd trusted the wrong person. But mostly he thought about Cla Walsh, working a graveyard shift in a diner, her brilliance hidden behind an apron, and how a single moment of attention, a single cup of spilled coffee, had changed both their lives. The lesson was painfully simple. Never mistake someone's circumstances for their character. Never confuse their current position with their potential. And never, ever underestimate the person who seems powerless, because intelligence, dignity, and justice don't require a title. They just require courage. Thomas Sunkla had learned that respect demanded without being earned is worthless. That betrayal always leaves a trail, and that arrogance blinds you to the very people who can destroy you. Cla Walsh had learned that patience is strategy, that every experience, even pouring coffee at dawn, teaches you something valuable, and that vindication doesn't come from others recognizing your worth. It comes from you never forgetting it, even when the world tries to make you invisible. And Alexander Drake had learned the most important lesson of all. The people who save you rarely look like heroes. They look like ordinary people doing extraordinary things, simply because they refuse to look away from injustice. Somewhere in Manhattan, in a high-rise federal detention center, Thomas Sunkla was learning his own lesson, that 23 years in prison is a long time to regret underestimating a waitress. Justice, it turned out, tastes better than any coffee ever served. If this story moved you, touched your heart, or made you think differently about the people around you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, respect costs nothing, but underestimating people can cost everything. Thank you for watching.